Watch his hand.
Allah, sleep now.
The man at the
sleep.
table is roughly 35 years old.
Little one,
His beard
it
is the
late.
dark brown
Sleep.
of a Galilean
Sleep now,
carpenter
little one.
who has
Sleep.
worked outdoors his whole life.
We are safe
His knuckles carry the small white scars of a tradesman who has known the slip of a chisel since boyhood. And in the center of his open palm, catching the last light through the shutter, lies a single gold coin. He has been turning it over for a long time. The coin is the last of what the wise men placed in his hands almost 2 years ago in a small house in Bethlehem, in a moment that already feels like another life.
They are good weight.
There was more
One
gold
tetradrachm
once.
for 3 denarii.
There were silver pieces. There were the smaller copper coins he received in change from money changers in 3 different cities. They are gone now. The pouch at his belt that
We're
once
almost
felt
there, I
heavy
think.
when he walked
Godspeed,
is now
everyone.
light enough
Stay
that he
alert.
sometimes checks it twice
Watch the
just to be
path.
sure he has not lost it on the road. In the corner of the
Not
room,
much
the
to
boy
spare,
stirs
traveler.
in his sleep. The young mother
is
does
all I
not
have.
wake. The carpenter looks at the coin one more time. He has been saving it for an emergency. He is about to learn that the emergency is here.
I have made
Outside
my
the shutter,
decision.
a donkey cart rattles by on the uneven cobbles. A woman's voice scolds a child
to
in a
me.
language the carpenter has come to
weight is
recognize,
true.
but still does not fully understand. The room he is sitting in is not his.
Looks good.
The country he is sitting in
It weighs
is not
true.
his. The
Thank
coin
you,
in his
honored one.
hand belonged 2 years ago to a foreign king he never met, and every small object on the table around him, the chipped clay cup, the worn leather strap, the small wooden cradle he carved himself in the 3rd month of their exile, has been bought in one way or another, with the slow, patient breaking down of a gift
must
that fits
keep
in his
this one.
palm. We are going to walk back through the 2 years that brought him to this moment, not
The
through a
exchange is
stained glass
complete.
window, not
Gold
through a
is
Christmas
secured.
card, through the
And for
actual
me?
road,
Wait for me,
the
Kenna.
actual border, the
Sleep
actual
now, my
rented
little
room,
dove. Sleep.
the actual coins he counted in the dark when his wife and his foster son were
morning.
asleep,
And
and
to
he
you,
was
Joseph.
the only one awake in a
Work
country
awaits.
he did not understand. 6 dreams have not yet come. 3 of the 4 are behind him. He is in the middle of the silence Scripture refuses to fill in. Matthew gives us 2 verses for these
Gently,
years.
feel the grain
2.
here.
We
Too
are
much
going to
force
give
will
him
split it.
65 minutes.
I see.
His name
The
is
pressure must be
Joseph.
subtle.
And the work he is about to do, the quiet, unrecorded, exhausting work of keeping a small family alive in a country that does not know who they
This
are,
wooden bowl is
is one of the
beautiful.
most
Thank
tender
you.
stories
It is
the
the
New
first one
Testament
I've sold in
refuses to
Egypt.
tell us.
I will take it.
So we are
May
going
it
to
serve
tell
you
it
well.
for him. He fled in the dark with a
Mary,
newborn
you're
and a
home.
teenage
Rest
mother.
now.
He carried
was a long
gold
day,
he could
but
not
I brought what
spend
I could.
without attracting the attention of every
Kalimera,
bandit on the
Maria.
road.
Καλώς ήρθες.
He crossed a
Kalimera.
desert patrolled
Είστε
by
πολύ
Herod's
ευγενικές.
informants
Είναι
and
καλό που σε
Nabatean
έχουμε
merchants
εδώ.
who would have sold the location of an unusual Jewish family for less than the price of a goat. He arrived in a country where he did not speak the language fluently, did not know the currency, did not know which neighborhoods were safe and which were not. He had no family there, no contacts, no workshop, no customers waiting for the foreign carpenter
morning
with the
is
Galilean
warm. Yes,
accent.
it will be a
And
good
somehow
day.
in a story
May the
Matthew
bread be
tells in 2
plentiful
verses,
and the
and most
harvest full.
sermons skip entirely.
Like this?
This refugee
Yes, exactly
carpenter
there.
kept
That's
the
it. Nicely
Messiah
done.
alive for 2 years. This
Thank
is
you.
how
I've
he
learned a
did
lot.
it. To understand what Joseph walked into, you have to understand what Egypt was in the year the family arrived. Egypt, by the time Jesus was born, was not a strange land to Jewish ears. It was a strange land to Jewish feet. Every Jewish child of Joseph's generation knew the story of Egypt the way American children know the story of Plymouth Rock. Egypt was where their ancestors
again.
had gone hungry.
feels
Egypt
good.
was where Joseph the patriarch, Joseph's
Look at this
namesake,
one.
1,500 years earlier,
That's it,
had
stuck it.
risen
You
from
did
a
it.
slave cell to the right hand of Pharaoh. Egypt was where Moses had been born, raised, and where he had finally
Not
led the
enough.
people out. To walk into Egypt as a Jew was not then to walk into a foreign country in the way
I
an
know.
American might walk into China today. It was to walk into a country that lived inside the bones of every Jewish prayer. It was to step into a story your grandmother had told you. It was to recognize in the shape of a Nile palm or the slant of a desert horizon the geography of 1,000 bedtime stories, and at the same time to be utterly unprepared for the actual weight of being there. There must have been a moment somewhere in the first few miles after the family crossed the border, when Joseph stopped and looked out across the Nile Delta for the first time. The green of the fields would have surprised him. The vast flat horizon would have surprised him. The smell of papyrus, the unfamiliar cattle, the heavy, slow turning of an enormous river, none of it would have looked like the Galilee he had left. This was a country of his prayers, but it was not a country of his feet. Here is what made Egypt different from any other country a Jewish refugee might have fled to in the first century. Egypt was home to one of the largest Jewish populations outside of Judea. Historians estimate that as many as 1 million Jews were living across Egypt by the time Joseph's family arrived. Some had come during the Babylonian crisis 600 years earlier. Some had come voluntarily under the Greek kings who succeeded Alexander the Great. Some had come for trade for opportunity for the simple reason that Alexandria was, at the time, the second greatest city in the Roman world. The Jewish quarter of Alexandria alone may have contained 100,000 people. There were synagogues throughout the country. There were schools. There were Jewish trade guilds. There were Jewish merchants whose ships sailed up the Nile and out into the Mediterranean. There was even briefly a rival Jewish temple at Leontopolis, built by a priestly family who had fled the religious politics of Jerusalem a century and a half before. The Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, the Septuagint, had been produced in Alexandria nearly 3 centuries before Joseph arrived. It was the version most Egyptian Jews read. It was the version their children memorized in school. A Galilean carpenter who had grown up hearing the Torah in Hebrew and Aramaic would have heard in the synagogues of Egypt his own scriptures in a foreign language, familiar and unfamiliar, at the same time, the words of his fathers in the cadence of a country his fathers had left. So in one sense, Joseph was walking into a country full of his own people. But in another sense, he was walking in alone, because community is not the same as kin. He had no relatives in Egypt, no second cousins he could send a message to, no name he could drop in a synagogue to be remembered, no letter of introduction from a Nazareth rabbi to an Alexandrian one. He had arrived without warning in the middle of a flight from a king's order, and there was no one waiting at any door to recognize him. In a culture built on family, on knowing whose son you were, whose grandfather had served, what synagogue whose cousin had married whose niece Joseph was for the first time in his life a man without a network. This is the loneliness that the Christmas pageants do not show. Imagine the scene. A first-century Jewish craftsman who has lived his entire life in one village of 400 people, where every door is a familiar door, suddenly walking through a city of 100,000, where no one has ever heard his father's name.
And so the
wells are unfamiliar. The bread is shaped differently. The Sabbath services have customs Joseph half remembers from rumor, but has never practiced. The Torah is read in Greek as often as in Hebrew. The mothers calling their children in from the street use a sing-song he does not recognize. He is among his people, but he is not among his people. And for Mary, the loneliness was sharper still. Mary had no female relatives nearby, no mother to help with a young child, no cousins to share work with at the well, no aunts to teach her the small things mothers always pass to daughters about how to raise a son. Consider what that meant for a 16-year-old. In her own village, the work of motherhood would have been shared. Her own mother would have been 3 doors away. Her aunts would have stopped by in the afternoons. The other young mothers she had grown up with would have sat with her at the loom and complained about their husbands and shown her the small tricks of caring for a small child. The community of women that surrounded every Jewish mother in every Galilean village was as important as the husband she had married. It was the invisible scaffolding of a young woman's first years of motherhood. In Egypt, that scaffolding was gone. She had no one to ask the small questions. She had no one to call when the child had a fever, and she could not tell if it was serious. She had no one to bring food when she was too exhausted to cook. She had no one to take the child for an hour, so she could simply sit alone in the small space behind her own eyes and remember who she had been before her life had become this. They were a household of 3 in a country of millions, and every morning Joseph had to find new customers in a marketplace where he was a stranger with a strange name. The first time we see the motif of this entire video, the single gold coin from the wise men, Joseph is choosing not to spend it. He knew what gold did in a foreign marketplace. A heavy gold coin from the wrong corner of the empire, pulled from the belt of a stranger with a Galilean accent, would not pass unremarked. The baker would notice. The baker's wife would mention it. The neighbors would ask, and a story would begin. The new family in the quarter, the one with the gold, the one with the wife who is barely 16, and the child who looks too young to have come from where they say they came from. Joseph could not afford to be a story. He had not crossed the Sinai to become a curiosity. So the gold stayed in the pouch.
We eat these bitter herbs
to
remember the bitterness
of
slavery.
The smaller coins he had gathered along the way, Roman copper, a few Nabatean pieces, the silver shekel he had been carrying since Bethlehem for emergencies. Those went first. The gold he saved. We do not know exactly where the family settled. The Gospel of Matthew, after telling us that Joseph took the child and his mother by night and departed into Egypt, gives us no further details. Matthew 2:14. 11 words covering hundreds of miles in several years. Tradition fills in the gaps in ways we cannot fully verify.
It is late.
The Coptic
Sleep.
Christians of Egypt,
Now,
descendants
little one.
of the very
Sleep.
Jewish Egyptian communities,
We are safe
the Holy
here.
Family may have lived among preserved detailed traditions of a route the family supposedly took. Specific towns are named. Specific stops are honored with churches. The tree of the Virgin in Mataria is honored as a place where Mary rested with the child. The Hanging Church in Old Cairo claims foundations connected to the Holy Family's stay. The monastery at Deir el-Muharraq holds traditions of a 6-month stay there in particular. Some of these traditions are clearly later embellishments. We cannot verify the route. We cannot verify the timeline, but the broad outline is plausible. A young Jewish family fleeing Herod's reach would almost certainly have headed for one of the existing Jewish communities of Egypt. Joseph was a craftsman. He needed work. He needed a synagogue where he could worship without explaining himself. He needed a community where his Galilean accent would be only the third or fourth strangest thing about the local population. And he needed most of all anonymity. The pouch grew lighter every week, and the gold coin untouched waited. Here's the thing about that gold coin. A heavy gold coin in the first century was not just money. It was a problem. It was too valuable for a baker's stall, too foreign for most synagogue treasuries, and too noticeable to spend without questions. To convert it into bread and rent and lamp oil, Joseph would have to do the one thing he had been avoiding since the day they fled Bethlehem. He would have to walk into a money changer shop. In a city where every transaction was watched, where every stranger was studied, where every unusual coin was a story waiting to be told, Joseph was about to hand a worn piece of foreign gold to a man whose entire trade was paying close attention.
Sleep.
And he had no choice. The day the smaller coins ran out is the day this
And to you,
story
Joseph.
really begins.
Work
We have to
awaits.
talk for a moment about what money was in the first century. It was not what it is for us. It was not a number on a screen. It was not a single national currency printed in standardized bills.
Gently.
It was
feel
a
the
small,
grain here.
heavy,
Too much
physical
force will
object
split it.
whose value
I see.
depended on its
The pressure
weight,
must be
its
subtle.
metal, its origin, and the trust of the person you handed it to. Every region had its own coinage. Rome minted silver denarii and gold
This wooden bowl
auri.
is beautiful.
The Greek
Thank you.
East
It
still
is the first one
circulated
I've sold in
tetradrachms
I will
from the
take it.
great cities
serve you well.
Antioch, Tyre, Sidon.
Mary,
Local
you're
Jewish
home.
authorities
Rest
had
now.
once minted
was
bronze
a long day,
coins
but I
under the
brought what I could.
Hasmoneans and would mint more
Καλημέρα,
under
Μαρία.
various kings
Καλώς
of the
ήρθες.
Herodian
Καλημέρα.
dynasty.
Είστε πολύ
The
ευγενικές.
Nabateans
Είναι
in the
καλό που σε
desert
έχουμε
south
εδώ.
of Judea minted their own pieces. The Parthians and the Persians east of the Roman frontier minted yet others often heavier, sometimes purer, almost always stamped with the face of a king no Roman citizen would have recognized. The unity of money was not a first-century concept. Every transaction was an act of translation. To move
The
from
morning
one
is
currency
warm.
into
Yes,
another,
it
you
will be a
needed a
good
money
day.
changer.
May the
He
bread
was
be
the
plentiful
necessary
and the
middleman of the
harvest
ancient
full.
economy. A money
Like this?
changer was not
Yes,
a banker.
exactly there.
He was
That's it.
something
Nicely
closer
done.
to a chemist with a license to gamble.
Thank you. I've
He
learned a
examined
lot.
every coin that came across his counter. He weighed it. He bit it gently to test the metal. He scratched it against a black touchstone to read the color of the streak. He calculated in his head what it was worth in the local currency and what he would charge in fees and clipping and exchange margin to make the transaction worth his trouble. In the larger cities, money changers were often Jewish. The trade required literacy in several scripts and a memory for the constantly shifting exchange
This
rates.
feels good.
In Alexandria, the changers' stalls
this
clustered
one.
near the harbor
Ooh.
and the great markets.
That's it, stuck it.
In
You
a
did
smaller
it.
Egyptian town, one or two changers might serve an entire region. In any city Joseph reached, there would have been a small, watchful
Not
man
enough.
behind a small wooden counter who knew with one glance more about your finances than you knew
know.
yourself. This is the man Joseph was about to walk in front of. But before we go inside the stall, before we watch what happened the first time, Joseph laid that gold on a stranger's counter, we have to back up. We have to talk about what happened on the road that brought him there. Because the gold did not arrive in Egypt easily. The Sinai crossing in the first century was not the empty wilderness most modern readers imagined. It was a working trade route. Caravans of merchants, pilgrims, soldiers, and traders moved up and down the road between Judea and Egypt in a steady seasonal flow. There were inns at the major waypoints. There were watering places guarded by local Bedouin who charged a small toll for the privilege of drinking. There were Roman patrols at the more important junctions. And there were eyes. Herod's reach did not stop at the Judean border. He had paid informants in every direction. He had agents who watched the major roads. He had a network of Nabatean
God's peace.
clients in the desert south
And
of
to
his
you,
territory,
Joseph.
and
The
a
usual?
network of
The usual?
Egyptian
Yes, for
Jewish
the
merchants
supplies.
who had
Thank
business
you.
reasons to stay in his favor. A man
I
fleeing
must weigh
Bethlehem
this.
with a
It's
young
the
wife
last
and a
time
small
it will
child
rest on
and a
this surface.
noticeably heavy belt pouch was exactly the
pouch
sort of
refilled with
traveler
smaller
an
pieces.
informant might
The
mention
careful
to the
counting.
wrong person
Copper,
at
silver,
the wrong inn.
enough for
Joseph
the
spent the
bread.
crossing keeping the gold invisible. He paid for water in copper. He paid for bread in copper. He paid for the small fees the desert travel required in the smallest pieces he had. The gold stayed in the deepest fold of the pouch untouched while the
The
lighter
light is
coins
warm,
ran through his
little one.
fingers at every stop. This is the discipline that almost no retelling
Peace
of the
be with
flight
you,
to
Mary.
Egypt acknowledges. Joseph was not merely moving from one place to another. He was performing for weeks on end a careful
I made
act
this
of
for you.
financial
Exquisite
concealment.
work, craftsman.
Every
Your
meal
order
was a
is blessing.
calculation.
Your reputation
Every
is well
overnight
deserved.
stay was
Consider
a
it done.
calculation.
Oh, look
Every
at you
conversation
go.
with a fellow
He did
traveler
it.
was a calculation. He had been entrusted by foreign
That's
astronomers
amazing.
whose
Good
names he
morning,
never
little
learned
one.
with the means to buy a refugee
Look
life.
at you, so
The means were
focused.
valuable enough to be dangerous.
What's this?
The means could only do their work if no one saw them. He reached the Egyptian border with the gold still concealed. He passed through the customs
Arise
station.
and take the
There was
young child
almost
and his
certainly
mother,
one,
and go into the
a
land of
small
Israel,
Roman
for
post
they are dead
collecting
which sought the
tolls
young
on
child's
imported
life.
goods with the gold
The
still
decision is
concealed.
made.
He walked the first miles into the Nile Delta
We
with the
must
gold
return.
still concealed. And only then, in the relative safety of a Jewish quarter in some Egyptian town, with rent due and bread to buy and a small foreign language conversation with a money changer waiting on the other side of a wooden counter, only then did the gold finally have to come out. For Joseph, walking into a money changer stall meant 3 risks at once. Risk 1, the coin itself. A
The
gold
leather
piece
strap of
from
the
the
sandal.
east brought by
Extreme
foreign
close-up.
astronomers who had
The same
arrived in
strap.
Bethlehem with the wrong question on their lips would not have been the standard currency of Galilean or Judean trade. It was almost by definition an unusual coin, and unusual coins attracted scrutiny. Risk 2. The question. A money changer would naturally ask where the coin came from. It was not rude. It was professional. He needed to know if the coin had been stolen, if it was counterfeit, if it had been clipped. It was a question Joseph could not answer truthfully. He could not say that the coin had been given to him by a delegation of foreign wise men
And so the
who had
little
ridden
monkey
into
swung from the
Bethlehem from
tallest tree,
somewhere east
looking
of the
for the
Persian
brightest banana in
frontier,
the whole
looking
jungle.
for a
He
newborn
swung
king.
higher and higher until
He could not say that he had carried it across the Sinai under the rising fear of Herod's soldiers. He could not say that the coin had bought him passage in a sense from a death he had narrowly escaped. He could only say that the coin was his, that it had been given to him by a traveling stranger, that he was a craftsman from Galilee who had come to Egypt to work, that
Look
he
at
needed
him.
to convert
He's
the
so
coin
small.
into
Come
smaller
on, you can do
pieces.
it.
Most
play
of
with
these
this.
statements
Yes,
were
let's
true.
play.
The one missing fact was the only one that mattered. Risk 3. The memory. Money changers in any era are professional rememberers
not,
of
Joseph.
unusual
Take Mary.
transactions. A
Rise,
Jewish
take the
carpenter
child,
with a
flee to
Galilean
Egypt.
accent walking in with a foreign gold coin is the kind of transaction a money changer would tell his apprentice about. He would mention it to his wife at dinner. He would remember it if anyone ever came asking, and Joseph could not guarantee that no one ever would. But the smaller coins were running out. The rent on the small room had to be paid. The baker had to be paid. The man who had let Joseph use a corner of his workshop for a small daily fee had to be paid. Lamp oil was almost gone. The blanket Mary had been using to cover the child at night had begun to thin in the middle. There was no other choice. We do not know the conversation. We can only reconstruct the shape of it. The Greek would have been awkward money changers spoke a trade. Greek that any merchant in the eastern Mediterranean could follow. But
يلا،
Joseph's
مش حنبط
Galilean
هنا طول اليوم.
Aramaic accent
امشي عقب.
would have softened the consonants in ways an Alexandrian ear would
I
catch.
must be ready.
He would have set the coin on the counter
This
gently,
last task
the way a man
requires
sets
all
down
my
something he has been carrying for a long time. He would have looked the changer in the eye briefly and then looked at the coin. The changer would have picked it up with 2
your
fingers,
head down, Mary.
turned it in the light,
We're almost out of
felt
the
its
dust.
weight against his
How much
thumb.
further, Joseph?
He would have known
I don't know
immediately
if I
that it
can
was
hold him
real.
much longer.
He would have known immediately that it was not local. He would have known immediately that the man in front of him was nervous, and that the nervousness was not the nervousness of a thief, but of someone who had been told to be careful for a very long time about something he could not name.
Delta.
The exchange would have taken minutes. The changer would have
We've
weighed the coin
arrived.
against his standard
May we
weights,
find
calculated
peace here?
its value in local
Why is
copper
this
and
night
silver,
different from all other
deducted his
nights?
fee somewhere
We eat
between
these
5
bitter
and
herbs to remember the
15%,
bitterness of
depending on
slavery.
his honesty
The
and his
finest oil from the
curiosity,
first pressing.
and counted
It is
out
good,
a small
but your
pile
price
of
is
smaller
high.
coins onto
I
the
will
counter.
give you 2 drachma.
Joseph would have gathered them into his pouch. He would have thanked the changer with a small nod. He would have walked out of the stall into the morning street, and somewhere in some part of his belt, the absence of that heavy gold coin would have registered as a small lightness, a freedom from one weight and acceptance of another. The gold was now scattered. But here is the part of this chapter that tradition gets wrong, that the Christmas
Sleep now.
pageants miss
Sleep.
entirely, that the most reverent
Little one,
retellings of this
it is
story
late.
still
Sleep.
tend to skip.
Sleep now, little
The
one.
gold from the
Sleep.
wise men was never enough.
We are
It was
safe
never
here.
a treasure. It was never a fortune. It was never the wealth of kings that medieval art has imagined, chests of gleaming coins, ornate caskets, a vault of riches that would have funded years of luxury in any city of the empire. We do not know exactly how much the wise men brought. Matthew tells us only the 3 gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh, without specifying
Are these
weights or
tetradrachms
amounts.
acceptable?
The
They are good
tradition of
weight.
3 wise
1
men is
tetradrachm
later.
for 3 denarii.
The tradition of vast treasures is later still. The gold was enough to fund a flight. It was enough to pay for food and lodging across the Sinai.
Keep
It was
close, my
enough
dear.
to rent a
We're
room
almost
and
there,
a
I
workshop corner in an
Godspeed,
Egyptian
everyone.
city.
Stay alert.
It was enough with careful
the
management to
path.
last until Joseph could build a small trade.
Not
But it
much
was
to
not
spare,
enough to
traveler.
retire on. It was not
It
enough
is
to
all I
live
have.
on without working. It was not enough by any first-century measure to be considered a rich family. The wise men brought provision. They did not bring
have made
escape.
my decision.
Because here is what Joseph did at the money changer's stall that day that almost no retelling
to
of
me.
this story will tell you.
The weight
He did
is
not
true.
exchange all of the gold. He kept 1 coin. He could have changed everything at once. He could have walked away with
Looks
a much
good.
larger pile of smaller
It
currency.
weighs true.
He could have solved the problem
you,
of his
honored one.
pouch for several months at 1 stroke. Instead, he held 1 coin back. He tucked it into the deepest fold of his pouch. He pressed his hand against it through the leather twice to make sure he could feel it. Why? We can only guess. Perhaps for emergencies. Perhaps because spending all of it at
I
once
must keep
felt
this
like a
one.
final acceptance that this exile would be long. Perhaps because in some
The
part of
exchange is
him
complete.
that had never quite
The gold is
recovered from the
secured.
wise men's visit,
And for me?
he still
Wait for me,
believed the
Kenna.
coin was for something else,
Sleep now,
some
my little
future
dove.
moment,
Sleep.
when only a piece of gold would do. He kept it back,
Good
and
morning.
he would carry it
And to
for the
you,
next
Joseph.
2 years. This is the
awaits.
part of the story that almost no one tells. The first 2 years in Egypt were not by any reasonable measure restful. They were not a hidden vacation. They were not a quiet, contemplative interlude where the
Gently
Holy
feel the
Family
grain
rested
here.
in the
Too
shade
much
of a
force
palm
will split
tree
it.
and waited
I
for the
see.
angel
The
to call
pressure
them
must be
home.
subtle.
They were 2 years of relentless, careful, exhausting reconstruction of a life that had been left behind in a doorway in Bethlehem in the
This
middle of
wooden
the
bowl is
night.
beautiful.
A carpenter
Thank
could
you.
not
It is
simply
the first
unpack
one
his
I've sold in
tools and
Egypt.
resume his
I will
trade
take
in a new
May it
country.
serve you well.
The wood was different. The Egyptian
Mary,
sycamore,
you're
the
home.
same tree
Rest
the
now.
patriarch
It
Joseph
was a
had
long
once
day,
been
but I
buried
brought
in,
what I could.
grew faster and softer than Galilean cedar. The acacia used for finer work was harder than anything Joseph had handled before. The local techniques were different. The local fasteners, the wooden pegs and pins were sized differently, were sometimes made of bone rather than wood, were sometimes glued with resins Joseph had never used. The tools themselves needed adjustment. Egyptian smiths sharpened blades to a different angle. The local oil stones
The
were
morning is
finer than the
warm.
ones
Yes,
Joseph
it will
had
be a
used
good
in
day.
Galilee.
May the bread
Even
be
the small
plentiful and
details
the
of
harvest
trade,
full.
the way a customer indicated
this?
which size
Yes,
of bowl
exactly
he
there.
wanted, the
That's it.
standard
Nicely done.
gestures for haggling over a price,
Thank you.
the
I've learned a
conventional
lot.
language of a delivery date were subtly different in an Alexandrian market. And the work itself, the kind of work an Egyptian customer expected from a carpenter, was different. In Galilee, a tecton built mostly for farmers. Yokes, plows, threshing sledges, the rough beams of village construction. In Egypt, especially in a Jewish quarter near a port city, the orders were more varied. Small boxes for traders, furniture for households slightly above subsistence. The repair of imported wooden items whose construction Joseph had never seen before. He had to learn not just a new wood and a new tool kit, but a new range of products. He had to learn it all. Imagine the humility of this. A man who had run his own workshop in Nazareth since before he was 20, who had taught younger men the trade, who had been a respected craftsman in his village, now standing in a foreign workshop with his hat in his hands, asking an older Egyptian carpenter to explain how the local joints were made. There is a particular kind of humility that only an older tradesman can practice. The young apprentice does not feel it as humility. He is simply learning because he has not yet earned the right to know. But a master of 40 years, suddenly returning to the position of an apprentice in a foreign workshop, knows exactly what he is doing. He is setting down something he had earned. He is admitting in front of younger men that there are things he does not know. He is choosing every morning when he walks into the workshop to be smaller than he is for the sake of becoming useful again. Joseph never speaks in Scripture, so we do not have his words for this season. But we have the shape of it. We have the visible humility of any tradesman who has ever had to relearn his craft in a new country. We have the half-translated gestures, the broken Greek, the careful nods, the slow accumulation of small skills that begin to add up after weeks and months to a competent local craftsman. The first job paid in copper, the second in copper, the third in eggs. The early months were the hardest. The savings from the wise men's gold exchanged in pieces, and smaller pieces were running through Joseph's hands faster than the work was coming in. The rent on the room was due each week. The bread had to be bought each morning. The lamp oil had to be replenished. The diapers. Yes, even in the first century, the equivalent of diapers, the small folded linens that wrapped a young child's lower body, had to be washed and replaced and washed again. And the gold coin, the single coin Joseph had held back, stayed in the deepest fold of the pouch. He pressed his hand against it sometimes. He felt for it before he slept. He checked it after every trip to the marketplace. It became a quiet ritual. The coin was not for spending. The coin was for knowing it was there. There is something almost unbearable in this small detail. A young father in a foreign country with no family to fall back on, and no certain future carrying a single gold coin, not to spend, but to feel the way some people carry a photograph, or a worn letter, or a piece of stone from a home they cannot return to. The coin was not money. The coin was reassurance. The coin was the last visible token of the night the wise men had knelt on the floor of a small Bethlehem house and confirmed in the only language they had that the carpenter's foster son was a king. By the end of the first year, the family had settled into a rhythm. Dawn prayer, the Shema said quietly in the small room, the child already learning to lisp the first syllables along with his foster father.
Close-up.
A small breakfast of bread and olives, and sometimes a piece of cheese from a Jewish dairy 2 streets over. Joseph leaving for the workshop. Mary tending the child and the small chores of the room, the water, the bread, the washing. There is a particular sacredness to the small repeated tasks of a refugee family. The making of bread becomes a ritual not just of nourishment, but of continuity, proof that this morning has happened, will happen again, has a future. The drawing of water from a well that is still strange after months becomes gradually an act of belonging. The folding of the same linen cloths in the same way at the same hour of every day becomes eventually a kind of prayer, midday meal. Sometimes Joseph came home, sometimes he ate at the workshop with the other craftsmen. The food was different from Galilee, more lentils, more flat bread. the strong onions of Egyptian cooking, sometimes a piece of grilled river fish. Joseph and Mary adapted slowly. The child who had known no other food adapted instantly. This is one of the small mercies of bringing a young child into exile. He does not know what he is missing.
Let's play with
To the
this.
boy, the bread is bread. The fish is fish. The onions are onions. He has no memory of a different cuisine to mourn. The flavors of his childhood are forming
Fear
in
not,
real
Joseph.
time around
Take
whatever
Mary.
his foster mother and
Rise,
foster
take the
father
child, flee
can
to
put on the
Egypt.
table, and in this case, those flavors are the flavors of Egypt as much as the flavors of Galilee. Afternoon work. The workshop slowly becoming more familiar. The other craftsmen slowly accepting Joseph as one of their number. The Egyptian master, who had first taught him the local techniques, now sometimes calling him over to help with a difficult joint, the recognition in a foreign land of one tradesman to another. Evening Shema, the evening meal. The reading of the Torah scroll Joseph had bought from a Jewish bookseller in the 3rd month, a small expensive purchase that had taken a noticeable bite out of the pouch. The lamp lighting, the child's bedtime, and then the bolt, always the bolt. For 2 years, every night Joseph slid that bolt, 650 nights. 650 separate moments of the same careful watchman's gesture he had made for years in Nazareth and would make for years again when he returned. The bolt was the same prayer in a different language. The bolt was the unspoken Shema of a foster father. The bolt was the small, repetitive, almost unnoticeable act that kept the Messiah of the world safe in a foreign room.
How much further,
Think about that
Joseph?
number for a moment.
I don't know if I can hold him much
650.
longer.
That is the kind of number that no gospel writer ever counted, because no gospel writer ever thought it mattered. It is the kind of number that is only meaningful in retrospect, when we sit back and try to measure the cost of an exile in something other than verses. 650 separate
arrived.
nights of a man rising from
find
his
peace
mat,
here?
crossing a
Why
small
is this
foreign
night
room and
different from
securing
all
the
other
door
nights?
behind which a young
We
mother
eat these
and
bitter
a small
herbs to
child
remember
were
the
sleeping.
bitterness of slavery. The
650
finest oil from the
separate
first
evenings
pressing.
of
It is
fatigue
good,
of
but your
worry,
price is
of
high.
small unspoken
I will give you 2
prayer.
drachma.
650 individual instances of the smallest, most ordinary fatherly gesture in human history, performed in a country that did not know it was witnessing one of the most important nightly acts of devotion in the history of the world. This is what tenderness looks like when no one is watching. It does not look like a ceremony. It does not look like a sermon. It does not look like the kind of thing a gospel writer ever thought to record. It looks like a man's hand on a wooden bolt at the end of a long day, sliding the same piece of wood into the same socket in the same wall of the same rented room for the 650th time in a row. By the end of the first year, the family had also begun to find friends. The synagogue slowly had begun to know them. The other young mothers at the well slowly had begun to know Mary. The other craftsmen in the workshop courtyard slowly had begun to know Joseph. Names had been exchanged.
Are these tetradrachms
Sabbath meals
acceptable?
had been
They
shared.
are good weight.
The household
One
across the
tetradrachm for
alley,
3
a
denarii.
Jewish family with 3 small children, had begun to send their middle daughter over to play with the small boy on long afternoons when the heat was too high to work. There is no gospel record
almost
of these
there, I think.
friendships. There are no names preserved. We do not know who
Watch
first
the path.
invited Joseph to a Sabbath meal in an Egyptian house,
Not much to
or
spare,
who
traveler.
first sat next to Mary at the
It is all
women's
I
section
have.
of a synagogue, or who first noticed that the small boy from Galilee was in some quiet way that no one could quite articulate
my
more
decision.
attentive than the other children his age. These people existed.
Give it
They
to
were
me.
the small, ordinary saints of the
weight is
Egyptian
true.
Jewish community who, without knowing it, took in the foster parents of the Messiah and treated them as if
Looks
they were
good.
just another refugee family,
It
which
weighs
is what,
true.
from their perspective, the Holy
Thank you,
Family
honored
was.
one.
The boy was learning the local words. He was learning Egyptian games. He was learning in the slow, patient way of a small child how to be a person in a place that was not his original home. And the gold coin in the deepest fold of Joseph's pouch stayed. What does a refugee do when the last reserve runs out? What does a man who has carried a single gold coin for 2 years do when the day finally comes that the coin must be spent not on a luxury, not on a celebration, but on the simple, ordinary work of keeping a small family alive for 1 more month? The next chapter of Joseph's life in Egypt is the one Matthew does not tell us. It is the chapter the Coptic tradition only hints at. It is the chapter that has been buried under 2,000 years of nativity scenes and stained glass windows and Christmas card serenity. It is the chapter where the gold finally moves. And it is the chapter that more than any other shows us what kind of foster father God had chosen. The gold coin came out of the pouch for the last time on an ordinary evening in the 22nd month of the family's exile. We do not know the exact day. We do not know the exact circumstance. But we know the shape of it because the shape of it is repeated in every refugee family that has ever lived through a long stay in a foreign place. The reserves run out. The smaller currency runs through. The careful pouch becomes a thin pouch, becomes an almost empty pouch. And the last hidden thing, the thing that was saved for an emergency, becomes finally the thing that pays the rent. Imagine the scene. The boy is asleep. He is nearly 2 years old now. He has just begun to string together short sentences in 2 languages. He calls Joseph by the Aramaic word for father, the same word every Jewish toddler in the Eastern Empire calls his father. He calls Mary by the Aramaic word for mother. He has in the last few weeks begun to ask questions. Small questions, the kind any toddler asks about the moon and the cat that lives in the alley and the bread and the lamp. He does not know that his father is sitting at a low table counting coins that will not stretch to the end of the month. Joseph picks up the coin. He puts it back down. He picks it up. He puts it back down. We do not have his prayer. We do not have his thoughts. We have only the gesture repeated, the way a man handles something he has been carrying for so long that letting go of it feels like letting go of more than just metal. Try to feel the weight of this small moment. A young husband in a foreign country with a sleeping wife and a sleeping foster son, 3 steps behind him, holding the last visible token of the night that confirmed his secret. For almost 2 years, the coin has been the one piece of evidence he could touch. When the doubts came in the night, and we have to believe the doubts came because doubts came to every prophet and patriarch in Scripture, and Joseph was a man like them. In this, the coin was the thing he could press his thumb against and remember. Foreign astronomers really did come. They really did kneel. They really did call him a king. It was not a dream. It was not a hope. It was a coin, a real coin, heavier than the silver, warmer in the light. A coin a foreigner had placed in his hand on a real night in a real room. And now he was about to spend it. There is no gospel passage for this moment. There is no traditional prayer attached to it. There is no church holiday that commemorates the night the last gold of the wise men became bread for an ordinary refugee family. This is one of the silences Scripture leaves us to fill with imagination, but also with reverence, because the silence itself is part of the meaning. Joseph did not get to mark this moment with a ceremony. He did not get to write it down. He simply did it the way men have always done the hardest, small acts of provision alone in the dark, with a sleeping family 3 steps behind them and a long walk to a money changer's stall ahead. The gold coin was the last piece of the wise men. It was the last piece of Bethlehem. It was the last piece of the night when foreign astronomers had knelt on a dirt floor and confirmed in the only currency they had that the child his wife was holding was a king. And now in a rented room in Egypt, a carpenter was about to break it for bread. We
Peace
do not
be with
know
you,
which
Mary.
money changer he went to. We do not know if it was the same one he had used 18 months earlier, or a new one, or a friend's friend
I
recommended
made
in a
this for you.
synagogue
Exquisite
conversation,
work, craftsman.
or simply the
Your order
nearest
is a
stall on the
blessing.
route to
Your
the
reputation is
marketplace.
well-deserved.
We
Consider it
know
done.
only that the
Oh,
coin
look at
moved.
You go.
We know only
He did
that the
it.
coin became smaller coins. We know only that the smaller coins
amazing.
became
Good
rent
morning,
and bread
little
and
one.
lamp oil and a new pair of
Look
small
at you, so
sandals for a
focused.
child who was now walking everywhere.
Watch this.
The transaction would have taken minutes. The money changer would have looked at the coin, recognized it perhaps as the same kind of foreign piece he had seen
Arise
from
and
this
take the young
same
child and his
carpenter
mother,
many months
and go into the
before.
land of Israel.
He might have
For they are
asked with the
dead which
polite
sought the young child's
curiosity of his
life.
trade whether business had been
decision is
hard
made.
lately. Joseph might have nodded. The two men
We
who
must
had now done
return.
business twice across nearly 2 years would have completed the exchange with the small, efficient gestures of strangers who have grown into quiet familiarity. The gold went into a locked box. The smaller coins went into a leather pouch. The transaction was over. And as Joseph walked back to the rented room that evening, the pouch heavier than it had been in months, but in a way that felt much
The leather
lighter.
strap of the
He
sandal.
was carrying something
Extreme
different than
close-up.
he had carried
The
before.
same strap.
He was no longer carrying the gold from the wise men. He was carrying the everyday provision of God. This is the moment the recurring motif of this video lands on its meaning. The single gold coin was never the point. The single gold coin was the visible token of an invisible providence. It was the thing Joseph could hold in his hand when he needed something to hold. It was the gift of a strange night that had to be carried forward into 1,000 ordinary nights of a long exile. And when the time came finally that the gold coin had to be broken, when the visible
And so the
token
little
had to
monkey
become
swung
invisible
from the tallest
again,
tree, looking
the
for the brightest
providence that
banana
had
in
ridden
the
in
whole
on the
jungle.
coin
He swung
did not
higher
leave.
and higher until
It just kept going. The work picked up that month. Coincidence tradition has long called such moments providence. We will leave the language to the reader. A new customer came in, an Egyptian Jewish merchant who needed a large set of small wooden boxes for a shipment. The order was substantial. The pay was steady. The reputation of the careful Galilean carpenter
Look at him.
began to
He's
spread
so
quietly
small.
through the
Come on,
surrounding
you can do
streets.
it.
A
Let's
second
play with
customer
this.
followed,
Yes, let's play.
then a third. The pouch began to recover some of its lost weight, though never quite to the level of the first year. Tradition holds that the family stayed in Egypt
Fear
for
not,
somewhere
Joseph.
between
Take
2 and
Mary.
4 years. We
Rise,
cannot
take the
verify
child,
the
flee to
exact
Egypt.
length. The earliest Coptic traditions suggest 3 or 4. Most historical reconstructions based on the death of Herod the Great in roughly 4 BC and the likely birth date of Jesus suggest a stay of between 1 and 3 years. But by the end of those 2 years, Joseph had built something almost no first-century refugee built. He had built a normal life, not a glamorous life, not a wealthy life, not a life that any chronicler of kings would have written down. A normal life. A workshop with a few steady customers. A rented room that was now decorated with the small touches of 2 years of careful homemaking. A community that knew his name. A child who was learning to play in 2 languages. A wife who was beginning to laugh more often. The miracle of Egypt in the end was not what happened. The miracle of Egypt was that nothing happened. No soldiers found them. No informants reported them. No disease took the child. No bandit robbed the
This last
workshop.
task
No
requires
landlord
all
turned them
my
out.
strength.
No language barrier proved unbridgeable. No homesickness broke Mary's quiet steadiness. No loneliness broke Joseph's quiet
Keep your head
endurance.
down, Mary.
They lived,
We're
they
almost out of the
worked,
dust.
they prayed,
How much
they
further,
raised a
Joseph?
small boy in a
I don't know
foreign
if I can hold
country
him much
on the
longer.
broken pieces of a single gold coin from a vanished delegation of foreign astronomers, and they kept the most important child in history alive for 2 years that Matthew covered in 2 verses. It is one of the strangest theological observations
The
the New
Delta.
Testament makes by accident. the most
We've
important
arrived.
window of human
May
history.
we find peace
The
here.
formation of the
Why
early
is this
childhood
night
of the
different from
Messiah
all other
happened in a
nights?
country that left
We eat
no
these bitter
gospel
herbs
record.
to remember the
There
bitterness
is
of
no
slavery.
apocryphal story
The
we can
finest
trust.
oil from the first
There is no
pressing.
eyewitness
It is good,
account.
but your price
There is
is
no
high.
chronicle of the
I will
first
give you
words
2
the boy
drachma.
spoke, the first steps he took, the first prayers he learned. There is only the quiet certainty that those things happened somewhere in the Jewish quarter of some Egyptian town in a
Yes,
rented
2
room
please.
that no longer
And you, my
exists
friend?
with parents whose voices
Excuse
we
me,
will
I'm
never
not from
hear.
around here.
The work was that
Δείξα.
ordinary. The work was that hidden. The
Περιμένετε
work
τη
was
σειρά
that
σας,
in the
γυναίκα.
end that important. And then
Ήρθα
one
από
night near
μακριά.
the end of the second year, the
Allah,
third dream
sleep
came.
now. Sleep.
Matthew 2:19.
Shh, little
The
one.
king who sought
It
the
is
child
late.
is
Sleep.
dead. Take the
Sleep
boy
now,
and his
little
mother
one.
and
Sleep.
return to the land of Israel.
We are safe
Joseph
here.
woke in the dark. He sat up. He looked across the room at his sleeping wife and his sleeping foster son. He looked at the small Egyptian objects of their life, the cradle he had carved, the shelf with the small clay menorah, the lamp burning low on the wall, the door with its wooden bolt. He looked at the pouch on the table beside him. He reached for it. He opened it. He turned out the contents.
Are these
It is one of the
tetradrachms
strangest
acceptable?
small
They are
images
good
in the
weight.
entire
1
Flight to
tetradrachm
Egypt
for 3
story.
denarii.
A man at a low table in the middle of the night in a foreign country, having just received from God the instruction to return home, and the first thing he does is count his
Keep
coins,
close, my dear.
not pray,
We're almost there, I
not
think.
wake his wife,
Godspeed,
not
everyone.
pack a
Stay
bundle.
alert.
Just look at the pouch
Watch the
and
path.
count what is left. A craftsman's instinct.
Not
A
much to
father's
spare,
instinct.
traveler.
The instinct of a man
It
who
is
has
all I
carried a
have.
small family for 2 years on the broken pieces of a single gold coin, and who knows that the road home will not be
I have
free.
made my decision.
There would be more journeys. There would be more bolts. There would be more dreams.
Give it to me.
There would be a return to Nazareth,
The wait
and a
is
long,
true.
quiet 18 years in the workshop, and a death scene Scripture refuses to give us. But the gold of the wise men, the
Looks
visible
good.
token of the strange night in Bethlehem,
weighs
was
true.
finished. What remained
Thank
was
you,
the
honored
man.
one.
What remained was the work he had built with his hands. What remained was the small family he had carried through 2 years of careful tenderness in a country that had never been theirs. What remained was Joseph. Now you know what the coin is. Now you know what the carpenter is holding. Now you know why his
must
thumb
keep
is
this
tracing
one.
the edge so slowly. Why his hand keeps closing around it and opening
exchange is
again, why the
complete.
pouch on the table
gold is
beside him
secured.
is so thin
And for
that
me?
it lies
Wait
flat
for me,
against the
Kenna.
wood. The coin
Sleep
is
now,
going
my
to
little
leave his
dove.
pouch
Sleep.
tonight. He has been carrying it for almost 2 years.
Good
He has
morning.
felt for it before
And
he
to you,
slept.
Joseph.
He has checked for it
Work
after
awaits.
every trip to the marketplace. He has held it through the long Sinai crossing, through the first awkward weeks in a foreign country, through the slow building of a small refugee life, through the
Gently
18th
feel
month
the grain
when
here.
the smaller
Too much
coins
force will
began to
split it.
run out, and
I
through the
see.
long
The
months
pressure
since
must be subtle.
when the coin was the last visible token of the night in Bethlehem. He is going to spend it, and he is going to spend it the way a tender man spends a
wooden bowl
thing
is
he
beautiful.
loves,
Thank you.
quietly,
It is the
carefully,
first
without
one I've sold in
ceremony, and
Egypt.
without
I will
telling
take it.
anyone what
May
it
it serve
cost
you
him to
well.
let it go. Remember the chipped clay
Mary,
cup on the
you're
table in
home.
our
Rest
prologue,
now.
the worn
It was a
leather
long
strap,
day, but I brought
the
what I
small
could.
wooden cradle Joseph carved himself
Καλημέρα,
in the
Μαρία.
3rd month of
Καλώς
their
ήρθες.
exile.
Καλημέρα.
Those
Είστε
small
πολύ ευγενικές.
objects, the
Είναι καλό
ordinary
που σε έχουμε
furniture
εδώ.
of an ordinary refugee room, were each in their own quiet way a piece of the gold coin. They had been paid for somewhere along the way with a fragment of what the wise men had given. The coin had not stayed a coin. The coin had become a room. The coin had become a cradle. The coin had become a life. This is what providence often looks like
The
in
morning
actual
is warm.
lives.
Yes, it
Not a
will be
miracle
good
that
day.
solves
May the
everything.
bread be
Not a
plentiful
chest of
and the
jewels that
harvest
funds the
full.
rest of the journey.
Like
A
this?
single gift,
Yes, exactly
modest,
that. That's it.
costly,
Nicely done.
given at exactly the moment it was
Thank
needed,
you.
that
I've
gets
learned a lot.
quietly turned into 1,000 small purchases over the course of a long season. Each purchase a quiet sacrifice. Each purchase a quiet trust. Each purchase a quiet act of faith that the gift was never meant to last forever, but to last just long enough. We have spent 65 minutes inside the silence of Joseph's 2 years in Egypt. We have walked the desert with him. We have stood at the money changer's stall with him. We have sat at the low table with him and watched the lamp burn low on the unspent gold. We have watched him bolt the door 650 times. We have watched him press his thumb against the pouch through the leather in 100 small, unconscious gestures across 100 ordinary days. We have watched the coin grow lighter, and the pouch grow lighter, and the man grow no lighter at all. And here in the last minutes is the small idea I want to leave you with. The work that holds the world together is almost always invisible. The fathers who keep the watch, the mothers who hold the children, the carpenters who repair the cracked sandals and bake the small bread and count the smaller coins by lamplight and slide the bolts at night. The refugees who learn a new language and a new currency and a new trade and a new neighborhood, not because they wanted to, but because the thing they were given to protect required it of them. These are the people who do not get chapters in any gospel. These are the people whose names get one mention in passing and then disappear into the long, faithful silence of God. And yet, without them, nothing. Without Joseph, the boy does not survive the first 2 years. Without Joseph, the family does not eat. Without Joseph, the bolts are not slid, the pouch is not managed, the gold is not kept hidden across the Sinai, the workshop is not rebuilt in a foreign country. Without the careful, invisible faithfulness of one silent carpenter, the entire history of Christianity is a different history. Tradition has called this kind of hidden work many things across 2,000 years.
Counting, copper,
the hidden
silver,
life,
the
little
for
way,
the Brent.
The work in the cell, the faithfulness of the small thing. The names change, the work does not. The work continues, the watch continues, the tenderness continues. In 1,000 quiet rooms across 2,000 years, the work Joseph did in Egypt is still being done. You may be doing it now. You may be the one in the small room, the one with the thin pouch, the one who has been carrying something so carefully for so long that letting go of it feels like letting go of more than just the thing itself. You may be the one counting the last reserves in a quiet kitchen tonight after the rest of the household is asleep. You may be the one who has been told in one way or another that the work you are doing in the dark is somehow not as important as the work other people are doing in the light. Joseph's 2 years in Egypt are the New Testament's quiet rebuttal to that lie. The most important child in history was kept alive by a man whose name we know, but whose voice we never hear.
And go into the
A
land of
man
Israel,
who never
for
had
they
a
are dead
public
which sought
role.
the young child's
A
life.
man who never wrote a letter
decision
that
is
survived. A man who never led a movement, never preached a
must
sermon,
return.
never gathered a single disciple. A man who for 2 years in a foreign country did nothing more visible than carry a gold coin in a thin pouch, count smaller coins by lamplight, and slide a bolt across a door at night. He kept the watch. He kept the boy. He kept the secret. And when the last coin had to leave his pouch, when the visible token of the
leather
wise men's
strap of the
confirmation
sandal,
had to become
extreme
invisible
close-up,
again,
the same
he did not
strap.
hesitate, and he did not announce it, and he did not ask for credit. He simply walked out into the Egyptian dusk and exchanged it for a month of bread, and he came home, and he sat down at the low table where the lamp had now been lit, and his wife handed him his evening cup, and the boy stirred in his sleep, and the room was warm. And the work he did in those 2 years, in the small, careful tenderness of an exile, no one was watching, became the foundation of every parable. That boy would later tell every miracle that boy would later perform, every word that boy would later say from the cross. 6
And
dreams,
so the little monkey
3
swung
behind
from the
him,
tallest tree,
3 more
looking
to
for the
come,
brightest banana
2
in the whole
years in
jungle.
Egypt,
He swung higher and higher
650
until
bolted doors, 1 gold coin, tenderness in the rooms no one was watching. May the God of Joseph, The God who chose a silent carpenter to raise a Savior, be the God who keeps watch over your quiet work too. In the small rooms, in the thin pouches, in the careful counting of coins that no one else will ever see, until your watch too is over, and the door finally is
Let's play
opened,
with this.
and the
Yes,
work
let's
finally
play.
begins to speak for itself. Next week, we are walking back into the same family from a different angle. Mary at the foot of the cross. The day the sword that Simeon had prophesied when she was still a teenager finally came for her. The day the boy she had wrapped in swaddling cloths in a Bethlehem lower chamber was wrapped instead in burial cloths. If Joseph's watch was at the door, Mary's watch was at the heart. And we are going to walk through it with her one quiet hour at a time. Until then, may your nights be peaceful. May your doors be safe. May the small, invisible faithfulness of your own life be seen by the one who sees in secret. Until next week, friend.
Ήρθα από μακριά